The radio crackled at 4:47 p.m. on December 11th, 1996, inside the cramped dispatch room of the Alaska State Troopers substation in Palmer. The voice came through distorted by static and wind, but the words were unmistakable. "We have a missing person situation at Independence Mine. Female hiker, 32 years old, separated from her group approximately 4 hours ago. Weather conditions deteriorating rapidly." Trooper Daniel Kovac grabbed the handset, his coffee going cold on the metal desk beside a stack of incident reports. Outside, the temperature had already dropped to -18 degrees Fahrenheit, and the forecast predicted worse. He'd worked search and rescue operations in Alaska for 11 years, long enough to know that 4 hours in conditions like these could mean the difference between life and death. The woman's name was Jennifer Calloway, a wildlife photographer from Anchorage, who'd been documenting winter animal behavior with 2 colleagues near the abandoned mining structures above Hatcher Pass. Before we dive into what became one of Alaska's most perplexing cold cases, tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe if you enjoy deep, real-world investigations like this one. Kovac pulled the topographic map from the filing cabinet and spread it across the table under the fluorescent lights. Independence Mine sat at roughly 3,500 feet elevation, a ghost town of wooden structures and rusted equipment left over from the gold rush era. The area sprawled across steep terrain cut by avalanche chutes and narrow valleys where snow accumulated in 20-foot drifts. Cell phone coverage didn't exist up there. The nearest landline was back down at the lodge, 12 miles by road. Jennifer's companions, Mark Hastings and Rebecca Chen, had hiked out to raise the alarm after failing to locate her during an initial 2-hour search of the immediate area. By 5:30 p.m., Kovac had assembled a response team at the Hatcher Pass Lodge parking area. 8 volunteers from the Alaska Mountain Rescue Group arrived in 2 4-wheel-drive trucks, their headlamps cutting through the early darkness. They unloaded gear under the harsh glare of portable work lights, avalanche probes, VHF radios tuned to channel 14, coiled rescue rope, thermal blankets sealed in waterproof bags, and a portable litter for medical evacuation. The temperature continued to drop. Kovac's breath formed white clouds as he briefed the team using a laminated map, his gloved finger tracing the search grid they'd established based on the companion's last known coordinates. "She was photographing a moose near these willows here," Kovac explained, tapping a contour line. "When Mark and Rebecca turned back to check on her 15 minutes later, she was gone. No response to their calls. They found boot prints heading northeast toward this drainage, but lost the trail in fresh snow." Rebecca Chen stood nearby, wrapped in a parka borrowed from the lodge, her face drawn with exhaustion and guilt. She'd been crying, her eyes red and swollen. "We should never have let her go off alone," she said, her voice breaking. "Jennifer was always pushing for that perfect shot. She'd see something and just wander. We knew she did that." Mark Hastings, older and more composed, shook his head slowly. "The moose spooked, went crashing through the willows heading upslope. Jennifer probably followed it, trying to get more frames. She had the Nikon F4 with the 300mm lens, heavy setup. Maybe it slowed her down." Kovac divided the team into pairs, each taking a compass bearing toward different sectors of the search area. They would move in sweeping patterns, calling Jennifer's name every 30 seconds, listening for any response. The SAR dogs wouldn't arrive until morning. The handlers were coming from Fairbanks, weather permitting. Overhead, stars began appearing through breaks in the clouds, their light cold and distant. The team moved out at 6:15 p.m., their headlamps bobbing like fireflies against the vast darkness of the mountain. The search continued through the night. Kovac and his partner, a veteran climber named Tom Braddock, worked methodically up the drainage, where the boot prints had been spotted. The snow had a wind crust that broke under their weight with each step, making progress exhausting. Every 20 minutes, they stopped to listen, their radios switched off to eliminate background noise. The silence was absolute, except for the occasional crack of a tree branch yielding under snow load somewhere in the darkness. They found nothing, no tracks, no torn fabric on branches, no equipment dropped in panic. By 3 a.m., the temperature had fallen to -26 degrees. Kovacs made the decision to pull back to the lodge. Continuing in these conditions increased the risk of a second casualty. The teams regrouped, stamping snow from their boots in the lodge's mudroom, their faces numb, despite layers of fleece and neoprene. No one had found anything substantial. The search would resume at first light with helicopter support if the weather cleared. Dawn came late and grey on December 12th. The Alaska State Troopers Bell 206 helicopter lifted off from Palmer at 8:45 a.m., Kovacs riding in the back with binoculars and a handheld VHF radio. The pilot, Carl Morrison, had flown search missions throughout the interior for 20 years. He knew how to read terrain, where to look for anomalies, a splash of color that didn't belong, disturbed snow patterns, or the dark shape of a body against white. They began systematic passes over the search area at 500-foot altitude, flying grid patterns while Kovacs scanned the ground below through the plexiglass bubble. The visibility was marginal, clouds hanging at 4,000 feet, but Morrison kept the helicopter stable as they worked methodically across each sector. Below, ground teams moved like colored dots through the snow, reforming their sweep lines. The radio chattered with position updates and negative reports. At 10:20 a.m., one of the ground teams discovered Jennifer's camera bag near a cluster of stunted spruce trees, approximately 2 miles northeast of her last confirmed position. The bag contained film canisters, lens cleaning supplies, and a granola bar, but the camera itself was missing. Kovacs directed Morrison to focus aerial coverage around the discovery point. They expanded the search radius, flying increasingly wider circles. The terrain grew rougher here, exposed rock faces, steep gullies, and frozen drainage channels cutting through the snowpack. It was easy country to get disoriented in, especially in deteriorating weather. Jennifer could have fallen, become trapped, or simply succumbed to exposure while seeking shelter. The ground teams worked inward toward the camera bag location, probing snowdrifts and checking under overhangs. By afternoon, they'd established that Jennifer had traveled a significant distance from where she'd separated from her group, moving with apparent purpose rather than random panic. But why northeast? What had she been following or pursuing? The moose tracks had long since vanished under fresh snow. There were no other obvious attractions in that direction, just wilderness extending for miles toward the Talkeetna Mountains. As darkness approached on the second day, the decision was made to maintain a base camp at the lodge and continue operations for at least another 72 hours. Family had been notified. Jennifer's parents were driving up from Anchorage. The media had picked up the story. A young photographer lost in Alaska's winter wilderness always generated coverage. Kovacs felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling across his shoulders. Every hour that passed decreased the probability of a live find, but he'd seen enough cases to know that certainty only came with evidence. On the third day, December 13th, the weather turned vicious. A low-pressure system moved in from the Gulf of Alaska, bringing heavy snow and winds gusting to 45 miles per hour. Helicopter operations were scrubbed. Ground teams could only conduct limited searching in the immediate vicinity of the lodge. Visibility dropped to less than 50 yards. The volunteers huddled around the wood stove in the lodge's main room, speaking in low voices, drinking coffee from styrofoam cups. Rebecca Chen had stopped talking entirely, staring at nothing through the frosted windows. Kovacs used the downtime to review everything they knew. He spread Jennifer's belongings across a table, items recovered from her vehicle parked at the lodge, and contents of the camera bag. Her wallet contained her driver's license, 2 credit cards, and $63 in cash. There was a small notebook with handwritten entries about animal behavior observations, sketches of tracks, and exposure settings for various lighting conditions. The last entry, dated December 10th, described photographing a wolverine at dawn near Ship Creek. Her professional but personal observations mixed with emotional reactions to what she was seeing. "Sometimes I think the animals understand something we've forgotten," one entry read. "They move through this landscape like they belong to it, while we just pass through, always observers, never participants." Mark Hastings sat down across from Kovac, nursing a mug of hot chocolate. "She talked about that sometimes," he said, when Kovac showed him the notebook entry. "Jennifer had this philosophy about wilderness photography. She felt like most photographers treated nature as a subject to be captured and controlled. She wanted to do something different, to somehow participate rather than just document. I never fully understood what she meant." "Did she ever take risks to get closer to wildlife?" Kovac asked. "Not reckless ones," Mark replied carefully. "She was experienced, knew the dangers, but yes, she'd push boundaries. She'd wait longer in bad weather, get closer than maybe she should have. It was passion, you know, not stupidity." The storm continued for 2 days, dumping another 3 feet of snow across the search area. By December 15th, the operation had been scaled back to periodic helicopter sweeps and limited ground patrols. The probability calculations had shifted into grim territory. Without shelter, food, or fire-starting capability, survival beyond 4 or 5 days in these temperatures was effectively impossible. The search was transitioning from rescue to recovery. Jennifer's parents, Robert and Linda Calloway, arrived on December 16th when the weather briefly cleared. Kovac met them in the lodge dining room, still wearing his field gear. Robert was a retired civil engineer, methodical and controlled even in his grief. Linda couldn't stop trembling despite the warm room. They wanted to understand everything, every decision, every timeline, every piece of evidence. Kovac walked them through it all, the map spread between them, his finger tracing the search patterns. "Where do you think she is?" Robert asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Kovac chose his words carefully. "Based on the direction she was traveling and the terrain, there are several drainages where she could have sought shelter. We'll keep searching those areas as weather permits. But I want to be honest with you, conditions have been extreme. The amount of new snow has buried any tracks or signs. We're doing everything possible, but—" Linda made a sound, like something breaking inside her. Robert put his arm around her shoulders, his own eyes wet. They sat in silence for several minutes, while other team members moved quietly around them, giving them space, but staying close enough to help, if needed. The search officially continued for another 10 days, growing more sporadic as resources were redirected to other emergencies. By Christmas 1996, the operation had been suspended until spring thaw. Jennifer Calloway was listed as missing and presumed deceased, though no body had been recovered. Her case file sat in a grey cabinet in Kovac's office, alongside dozens of others. People who'd walked into Alaska's wilderness and never returned, claimed by falls, exposure, avalanches, or simple bad luck in an unforgiving landscape. Kovac couldn't let it go. Something about the case bothered him. Though he couldn't articulate exactly what, he kept copies of the file at home, reviewing statements and evidence during sleepless nights. The camera bag kept coming back to him. Why had Jennifer set it down there, in that specific location? What had she seen or been doing that required putting down her gear? The camera itself had never been found, which meant she'd either kept it with her or lost it elsewhere. A Nikon F4 with a 300mm lens weighed several pounds, not something you'd drop casually. Spring came slowly to the high country in 1997. As soon as the snow began melting in May, Kovac organized follow-up searches focusing on the drainage systems where runoff would expose anything buried during winter. Volunteer teams hiked the terrain again, this time in daylight that lasted 18 hours, scanning scree fields and creek beds. They found scattered caribou bones, old mining equipment, and the remains of a hunter's camp from previous years, but nothing connected to Jennifer Calloway. The file remained open but dormant. Kovac retired from the state troopers in June 1998 after 24 years of service. His replacement, Trooper Sarah Mendez, inherited the case files. Kovac briefed her personally on several cold cases, including Jennifer's. "Watch for hikers finding personal items during summer season," he told her. "Sometimes it takes years, but things surface. Keep the Calloway file active in your mind." Mendez was thorough and dedicated, but she had dozens of active cases competing for attention. Jennifer's disappearance became one of many unsolved wilderness mysteries, referenced occasionally when new missing person reports came in, used as a cautionary example in SAR training scenarios, but largely faded from active investigation. Then on August 19, 1999, a geologist named Michael Torres was conducting mineral surveys, approximately 7 miles northeast of Independence Mine, when he saw something that made him stop mid-stride. At first, he thought it was a mannequin, some bizarre piece of trash left by miners or hikers, but as he approached, his chest tightening with growing horror, he realized it was a human body. The figure was standing upright against the entrance of a small, partially collapsed mine adit cut into a rock face. The woman, clearly a woman despite the effects of exposure and time, stood with her arms at her sides, her head tilted slightly back, her eyes open and staring at the sky. Her body had been preserved by the cold, mummified by the combination of freezing temperatures and dry wind that whistled constantly through this exposed basin. She wore hiking clothes faded and torn by weather, a blue jacket, dark pants, leather boots. Her blonde hair, matted and discolored, hung to her shoulders. Torres stumbled backward, his surveying equipment clattering to the ground. His hand shook as he pulled the Motorola radio from his pack and keyed the transmit button. "Base, this is Torres. I need emergency response to my location. I found a body, a standing body. Something's very wrong here." The coordinates he provided were logged at the Willow Creek Ranger Station at 2:43 p.m. Within an hour, State Trooper Mendez was en route by helicopter along with a forensic team and the medical examiner, Dr. Patricia Vance. They landed in a small clearing 50 yards from Torres's position, the rotor wash kicking up dust and small stones. Torres met them at the landing zone, his face pale and drawn. "I didn't touch anything," he kept saying. "I didn't know what to do." "Should I have covered her? Was I supposed to?" "You did the right thing," Mendez said, her voice calm and professional despite her own churning thoughts. She'd reviewed the Calloway file just 3 months earlier during a case review session. She had a horrible feeling about whose body Torres had found. They approached the site carefully, documenting everything with photographs as they moved closer. The mine adit was old, probably dating to the 1930s or 40s, a horizontal shaft drilled into the mountainside that extended back into darkness. Timber supports framed the entrance, though several beams had rotted and collapsed. The woman's body stood perhaps 6 feet from the added entrance, positioned as if she'd walked out from the shaft and stopped, frozen mid-step. Dr. Vance conducted her initial assessment with practiced efficiency, photographing the body from multiple angles with a Nikon FM2 and noting observations into a handheld cassette recorder. Female, appears to be in her 30s, approximately 5'6" tall. Body shows extreme preservation, consistent with cold temperature mummification. Rigor mortis has long since passed, but the body has frozen in an upright position, likely due to the specific conditions of exposure. Eyes are open and desiccated. Clothing is weather-damaged, but intact. No obvious signs of trauma to the exposed areas. Mendez circled the scene slowly, taking in details. Around the woman's neck hung a camera strap, but the camera itself was missing. Just the frayed end of the strap remained. On the ground nearby, partially buried in accumulated soil and pine needles, Mendez spotted the corner of something metallic. She carefully excavated it with a gloved hand, a Nikon F4 camera body, the lens shattered, the film advance lever frozen in position. The exposure counter window showed frame number 28. Would you have made the same call if you'd been in their place, to continue documenting even as danger closed in? The forensic team spent 4 hours processing the scene before authorizing removal of the body. They documented every angle, collected soil samples, searched the immediate area for any other evidence. Inside the mine adit, using high-powered flashlights, they discovered signs of recent occupation, relative to the mine's age. There was a makeshift shelter created from an emergency thermal blanket anchored to timber supports, now mostly collapsed. Empty water bottles, food wrappers from granola bars, and most significantly, a small notebook identical to the one found in Jennifer's camera bag. Trooper Mendez opened the notebook carefully, its pages brittle from moisture and time. The entries were in the same handwriting, but these were different, disjointed, increasingly desperate. The first entry was dated December 11th, 1996. Found the moose carcass. Something killed it recently. Wolf pack, probably. Got amazing shots of the blood trail in the snow. Followed it further than I should have. Can't find Mark and Rebecca now. Getting dark. Saw this mine entrance. Will shelter here for the night and head back at first light. The entries continued day by day, growing shorter and more fragmented. December 12th. Tried to walk out, but storm hit. Can't see anything. Back to mine. Have some food. Will wait. December 13th. Storm worse. So cold. Camera died. Film advance frozen. Have to stay put. The handwriting became shakier. December 15th. Parents will be worried. Miss them. Miss everyone. Cold is inside me now. The last entry was dated December 18th. Barely legible. Walking out today. Clear weather. Can't feel my feet. Light ahead. Finally going home. But she hadn't gone home. She'd walked out of the mine into what was probably another brief clear period, and there, perhaps overcome by hypothermia-induced confusion or simply exhaustion, she'd stopped. Her body had frozen in that position, standing upright, preserved by the extreme cold. Subsequent snowfall and wind had buried her throughout the winter and into spring, only to have her re-emerge years later as the snow patterns shifted and the ground around her gradually subsided. Dr. Vance supervised the careful removal of Jennifer's body, which was placed in a specialized transport container for the journey back to Anchorage. The autopsy would provide definitive identification through dental records and potentially fingerprints, though Mendez already knew who this was. The notebook, camera, and other personal items were bagged and labeled as evidence. At the State Medical Examiner's facility 3 days later, Dr. Vance completed her examination. The autopsy confirmed the identity through dental comparison. This was Jennifer Marie Calloway. The cause of death was determined to be hypothermia and exposure. The toxicology screen showed no drugs or alcohol. Jennifer had been completely sober and aware as she'd succumbed to the cold. The film from the recovered Nikon F4 was sent to a specialized lab that worked with damaged archival materials. After careful processing in a darkroom using modified development techniques, technicians were able to recover 24 of the 28 frames. The first images showed the moose Rebecca and Mark had mentioned, magnificent in its winter coat, steam rising from its nostrils. Then came shots of the same moose dead, its throat torn open, blood sprayed across pristine snow. Wolf tracks circled the carcass. The subsequent frames showed Jennifer's descent into her ordeal with haunting clarity. Photos of the mine entrance, the interior with her flashlight illuminating timber supports, the view looking out from her shelter as the storm raged. There were several self-portraits, Jennifer holding the camera at arm's length, her face showing progressive deterioration, fear giving way to resignation. In the final recovered frame, she'd set the camera on something stable and used the self-timer. The image showed her inside the mine, wrapped in the thermal blanket, her eyes reflecting the camera's flash, alert, alive, and terribly alone. Trooper Mendez compiled the complete case report over the following weeks, incorporating all evidence and forensic findings. The technical explanation for Jennifer's upright preservation was straightforward. She'd experienced terminal burrowing behavior, a known symptom of severe hypothermia where victims paradoxically feel warm and remove clothing or behave erratically. In Jennifer's case, she'd walked from the mine during a moment of hypothermic confusion, and her body had frozen rapidly in the sub-zero temperatures, likely within minutes. The specific microclimate at the mine entrance, with constant wind flow and extreme cold, had desiccated and preserved her body in that position. The official finding, Jennifer Calloway had survived for approximately 7 days after her initial disappearance, sheltering in an abandoned mine adit, approximately 7 miles from her last known location. She'd had minimal supplies, but had attempted to maintain hope and rationally plan her survival. Death occurred on or around December 18, 1996, from hypothermia and exposure. The delayed discovery was attributed to the remote location, heavy snow coverage throughout winter and spring, and the specific terrain features that made aerial spotting extremely difficult. But there were elements that continued to trouble Mendez as she closed the file. Why had Jennifer ventured so far from her original location to photograph the dead moose? The notebook suggested she'd been excited about the find, viewing it as a rare opportunity to document predator-prey interaction. But that decision, to follow the trail alone, to prioritize the photographs over safety protocols, had ultimately proven fatal. It was a reminder of how quickly wilderness situations could deteriorate, how small choices cascaded into irreversible consequences. Robert and Linda Calloway were notified of the findings on September 3, 1999. Mendez met with them in Palma, bringing copies of selected photographs, those showing Jennifer alive and working, not the later images documenting her decline. She walked them through the timeline, the evidence, the location. Linda wept quietly, while Robert asked detailed questions, his engineer's mind needing to understand the precise sequence of events. Could she have been found if the search had continued longer? Robert asked finally the question that had clearly been consuming him since learning his daughter had survived those 7 days. Mendez chose her words carefully. The area where she was located was beyond the practical search radius given the weather conditions. The mine entrance was partially obscured by rock formations and wasn't visible from the air. Ground teams would have needed to physically walk within 20 yards of the site to spot it, and that particular drainage wasn't identified as high probability during initial operations. Additionally, the snow cover was extensive. I believe everything that could reasonably have been done was done, but Alaska is vast, and sometimes... She didn't need to finish. Robert nodded slowly, his hand gripping Linda's. They understood. Alaska gave and took on its own terms, indifferent to human wishes or efforts. Jennifer had made a choice to pursue her passion, and the wilderness had extracted the ultimate price. The funeral was held in Anchorage on September 10, 1999. Trooper Daniel Kovac, now retired, attended. He stood at the back of the chapel, listening to family and friends remember Jennifer's life and work. After the service, he approached the Callaways. "I worked the initial search," he said quietly. "I wanted you to know that everyone involved did everything possible. Your daughter she was extraordinarily unlucky. Wrong place, wrong moment, wrong weather window, but she fought to survive. That notebook shows she kept trying, kept hoping. That takes courage." Robert shook his hand firmly. "Thank you for that. It helps to know she didn't give up." In the weeks following Jennifer's funeral, several of her photographs were exhibited at a small Anchorage gallery. The images recovered from her final roll of film, particularly those of the moose before and after death, drew significant attention. Art critics noted the technical excellence and emotional power of her work. One reviewer wrote, "Jennifer Callaway captured the raw truth of Alaska, beautiful and brutal, giving and taking." Her final photographs document not just wildlife, but the relationship between observer and observed, between human ambition and natural indifference. They are haunting precisely because we know the cost of their creation. Mendez added a final note to the official case file before moving it to the closed cases archive. "This investigation demonstrates the importance of maintaining rigorous safety protocols in wilderness environments, the limitations of SAR operations in extreme weather, and the need for better education around hypothermia symptoms and shelter-seeking behavior." Jennifer Callaway's experience, while tragic, provides valuable lessons for outdoor recreationists and professional guides. Her survival for 7 days in severe conditions shows both human resilience and the critical importance of proper preparation. The mine Adit, where Jennifer had taken shelter, was later marked with a small memorial plaque installed by the Alaska Wilderness Heritage Foundation. It reads simply, "In memory of Jennifer Callaway, 1964-1996, wildlife photographer." She saw the wilderness clearly. The site occasionally receives visitors during summer months, photographers, hikers, and family members who make the difficult trek to understand where and how she spent her final days. For Trooper Mendez, the Callaway case became a defining investigation of her career, a reminder that cold cases could warm again unexpectedly, that the wilderness sometimes yields its secrets years after hope has faded. She keeps one of Jennifer's photographs on her office wall, not one of the final, desperate images, but an earlier shot from her portfolio. A wolf pack moving across a snowy ridge at dawn, their bodies silhouetted against pink and gold light. It reminds her why people are drawn to places like Alaska, despite the risks, why they venture into the backcountry seeking moments of transcendent beauty, even when they know the landscape doesn't care about their survival. 3 years Jennifer stood there, preserved by cold, her eyes open to the sky she'd tried so hard to capture on film. 3 years while seasons changed, snow came and went, and life continued in the valleys below. When she was finally found, standing upright against the mountain, it seemed impossible, a violation of natural law. But the explanation, when fully understood, was entirely natural: cold, wind, desiccation, and the specific geometry of that exposed location combining to preserve her body long after death. Not supernatural, not mysterious, just physics and biology operating according to their immutable rules. The Callaway case files now reside in the Alaska State Troopers' archives, available to researchers and SAR training instructors. The photographs Jennifer took, both the professional work created before that fatal December day and the final frames documenting her ordeal, are maintained by her family trust. Some have been published in wilderness safety educational materials used to illustrate the rapid progression of hypothermia and the critical importance of staying found rather than chasing shots. Robert Callaway donated Jennifer's surviving camera equipment to the University of Alaska's photography program, where it's still used by students learning wildlife documentation techniques. A scholarship in her name supports aspiring nature photographers with one requirement: recipients must complete a comprehensive wilderness survival course before receiving funding. Jennifer was passionate and talented, Robert said at the scholarship's establishment. But she made one mistake that cost her everything. We want to honor her memory by helping others avoid the same fate. What would you have done differently if you'd been in Jennifer's position, seeing that perfect shot just beyond safe boundaries? It's easy to judge from comfort and hindsight, but in the moment when passion and opportunity align, the line between acceptable risk and fatal mistake can blur like a photograph out of focus. If you appreciate real investigations like this one, stories that honor the truth without sensationalism, that seek to understand rather than exploit, subscribe and stay curious. The wilderness holds countless stories, and some of them, like Jennifer's, take years to tell.